church and had the opportunity to speak to an audience here, and I believe there are even some people who heard me 10 years ago. I hope I don't look too bad after 10 years. But a lot of water has flowed under the bridge, and of course much has happened in America, particularly with education. And we're learning more and more every day about the plans that the elite have for us. And so we're really much better informed today than we were 10 years ago, even though we had a lot of information then. But it's simply that the powers that be have been tipping their hands so regularly that it's almost impossible not to recognize what is being done to us. So I'm going to speak in a rather philosophical terms about what has been happening, and then get into OB a little more in more detail. But you know, we Americans are a very special breed. Something in our psyche, in our culture, has set us apart from other nations. In fact, people in other countries cannot understand why so many Americans have such a deep distrust of government. But when these foreigners arrive in this country as immigrants and expect to find themselves in the land of the free and the home of the brave, they find themselves in the land of bureaucratic regulation and educational confusion. They settle in cities where the crime rate is much higher than in the countries they left. Yet few return to their countries of origin because they detect something in America that is different and not to be found anywhere else. The deep sense of hope, an indefatigable entrepreneurial spirit, boundless energy, the religious fervor of millions of individuals who are trying to restore America to what it once was, a nation under God, a land of unlimited opportunity and limited, unobtrusive government, bound by a constitution based on biblical principles. Ayn Rand, the novelist, put it in these words, quote, "The most profoundly revolutionary achievement of the United States of America was the subordination of society to moral law," unquote. That moral law, of course, was biblical law. Early visitors to America remarked on that aspect of the American way of life. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French historian who visited America in the 1830s, said, quote, "Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention, and the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from this state of things. In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America, and there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than that its influence is powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth. Christianity, therefore, reigns without obstacle, by universal consent. The consequence is, as I have observed before, that every principle of the moral world is fixed and determinate. The safeguard of morality is religion, and morality is the best security of law, as well as the surest pledge of freedom. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits flame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because America is good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." Unquote. That was Alexis de Tocqueville back in the 1830s. How far we have come from that benevolent state in which biblical law set the moral standards of American society. Today, what we have in America is the subordination of society to bureaucratic law, the law of the state. Yes, these laws were enacted by the legislators we elect. But too many of these legislators no longer believe in the primacy of biblical law. They believe that man's law is superior to God's law. We call that philosophy humanism, and that's the philosophical foundation of liberalism. Liberalism goes under many guises: progressivism, socialism, collectivism. No matter what you call it, its most significant principle is its rejection of God as the true sovereign over our nation. And of course, this has serious consequences for the family and for education. Humanism is an organized religious philosophical movement dedicated to the overthrow of Christianity. The humanists declared war on Christianity in 1933 with the proclamation of its Humanist Manifesto, which states, quote, "Religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life, the intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions with a view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. Certainly religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted as rapidly as experience allows in order to function effectively in the modern world," unquote. In other words, the humanist program calls for taking control of and transforming all of the cultural and religious institutions and associations of the nation so that they will be made to effectively advance the humanist agenda. No other religion in America calls for taking over the institutions and associations of other religions. We are supposed to be living in a society where religious freedom is respected by all religions, but we have it in the words of the Humanist Manifesto itself, the intention of humanists to reconstitute everybody else's religious institutions, rituals, and ecclesiastical practices to conform with humanist goals. Nowhere has the philosophical conflict between humanism and Christianity been better explained than in Dr. Rousas J. Rushdoony's classic book, The Messianic Character of American Education. For it is in the field of education that the conflict has raged most intensely. It should be noted that one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto of 1933 was John Dewey, father of progressive education. Dr. Rushdoony shows that humanism not only threatens Christian education, but educational freedom in general, because there is a link between religious liberty and educational freedom. Americans are slowly becoming aware that spiritually and morally, education is basically a religious function, even when it is atheistic, and Christian education is hardly viable without religious freedom. As Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "Among Nietzsche's manuscripts after his death was found a slip of paper on which he had written these words: 'Since the old God has been abolished, I am prepared to rule the world.' This is the meaning of humanism's inescapable totalitarianism. Total government is a necessity, and everything in man requires it. If there is no God to provide it, then man must supply it." In the United States, the efforts of federal and state governments to control churches and Christian schools are the logical results of their humanism. There must be sovereignty in law, and it must be man's, not God's, is their faith. Clearly, we are in the basic religious war, and there can be no compromise nor negotiation in this war. Humanism seeks to abolish the God of Scripture and rule the world," unquote. In America, the ultimate aims of humanism can only be achieved through the control of children and their education. The fundamental issue, therefore, is the ownership of children. Do humanists have the right to indoctrinate children in the public schools with humanist values without the knowledge or consent of the parents? On this issue, Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "The first and basic premise of paganism, socialism, and Moloch worship is the claim that the state owns the child. The basic premise of the public schools is this claim of ownership, a fact some parents are encountering in the courts. It is the essence of paganism to claim first the lives of the children, then the properties of the people," unquote. There are many cases in which compulsory school attendance laws have been used to deprive parents of their children. The most egregious case I know of is that of Barry Bear, an 18-year-old youth who has spent the last 5 years in state custody in Iowa because of truancy. Barry's mother, Anna Bear, is a white woman married to a Native American with whom she has had 4 sons and a daughter. The family lives on a reservation near Tama. Barry is mildly retarded and has what the public schools like to call special needs. But like many retarded children, Barry also suffers from a variety of ailments, mainly gastrointestinal. And so when it came to attending school, Barry was absent a great deal. However, that should not have bothered the school, since Anna Bear taught school for 20 years, was certified, and could teach her son at home. However, in May 1989, the Iowa Supreme Court ordered that Barry, then 12, be forced to attend school. His parents refused. And so in 1991, after a long court battle, Barry was removed from his home and placed in foster care. Barry has now been in state custody for 5 years. He's been in 4 or 5 foster homes, 4 or 5 schools in which he's learned how to tie his shoelaces, but not much else. He is presently at a residential hospital where he is being drugged and has become addicted. This mild, gentle boy has become a violent young adult who wants to go home. He is now their prisoner. He wants to go home to be with his parents and brothers and sisters. But the state will not let him go home. He is now their prisoner. Even though he has reached the age of 18 and is beyond compulsory school age, the court refuses to release him. Why? Because they own him. And they want every homeschooler in Iowa to know that they own him. And every other child they can get their clutches on. And we know why. The Des Moines Register of January 12, 1989, carried the following small item under the heading of State House Briefing. Quote, "Iowa prosecutors are seeking more power to intervene in truancy cases and have suggested law changes that could give county attorneys more tools to use against fundamentalist Christians who want to teach their children at home. Recommendations from the Iowa County Attorneys Association include a change in the state's juvenile code to add truancy to the list of reasons officials can start proceedings that can lead to removing the child from the home or to terminating the parent's rights to their child," unquote. So you see the state, they planned all of this. Thus, the humanist state can legally kidnap any child it wants through the compulsory education laws and keep that child prisoner for as long as it wants, which means that the issue of Christian liberty can only be resolved in a philosophical confrontation between Christians and the state, and that confrontation is unavoidable. I say philosophical confrontation, not a physical confrontation, since the government has shown little restraint in its handling of citizens who disagree with its laws. The ATF called out the U.S. Army with tanks and helicopters and 70 armed agents just to serve the hapless David Koresh with a search warrant. For what? A technical gun violation which would have gotten Koresh maybe 3 months in jail if found guilty. Which means that you don't confront this crazy government physically if you want to survive. As long as this civil war can be fought in the courts and in the polling booths and by the legal actions of its citizens, there is no reason for physical confrontation. Our goal must be the recognition of God's sovereignty over this nation. The principle of God's ownership was implicitly understood by the founding fathers who wrote the U.S. Constitution and upheld God's sovereignty over man. George Washington, in his inaugural address in 1789, after being sworn in as first President of the United States under the new Constitution, said, quote, "Such being the impressions under which I have, in obedience to the public summons, repaired to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps finally, staked on the experiment." Unquote. Thus it was clearly understood at the very birth of the American Republic that God's sovereignty ruled over the United States, and that as long as the civil government remained subordinate to God's sovereignty, it was legitimate and thereby supportable by Christians. But the introduction of secular, government-owned and controlled schools and colleges began to erode that basic understanding in the minds of the American people. Statism, the philosophy that the state is the supreme power, slowly absorbed the loyalty of America's academic elite. Slowly but surely the concept of religious freedom gave way to that of religious toleration. The original concept of religious freedom meant that the state had no jurisdiction over the church, its schools, or its affairs. But the new doctrine of religious toleration meant that the state granted certain privileges to churches and religious schools at its own pleasure. Privileges such as tax exemption, which could be withdrawn at any time for some compelling state interest. Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "The fact is that religious liberty is dead and buried. It needs to be resurrected. We cannot begin to cope with our present crisis until we recognize that religious liberty has been replaced with religious toleration. We may be able to live under religious toleration, but it will beget all the ancient evils of compromise, hypocrisy, and a purely or largely public religion. It will replace conscience with a state license, and freedom with a state-endowed cell of narrow limits. This is the best that toleration may afford us in the days ahead." Unquote. This basic philosophy of statism and religious toleration has important ramifications for the Christian family. Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "In Scripture, the family is the basic institution of society to whom all the most basic powers are given, save one, the death penalty. Hence, the death penalty could not be executed on Cain. The family is man's basic government, his best school, and his best church. To review briefly the basic powers which Scripture gives to the family, the first is the control of children. The control of children is the control of the future. This power belongs neither to church nor state, nor to the school, but only to the family. Second, power over property is given in Scripture to the family. God gives control of property into the hands of the family, not the state nor the individual. Third, inheritance in Scripture is exclusively a family power governed by God's law. Fourth, welfare is the responsibility of the family, beginning with the care of its own. Fifth, education, a basic power, is given by God to the family as its power and responsibility. The modern state claims the right to control and provide education, and it challenges the powers of the family in this area also. Humanistic statism sees control of the child and the family as basic to its drive toward totalitarianism, unquote. I think you can sense now why the homeschooling movement is so important to America during this time of cultural civil war. The means to restore Christian liberty and constitutional government are limited by the very circumstances of the battlefield. The battlefields of this civil war are to be found in the courthouses, the legislatures, the media, and most important of all, in the actions that citizens can take to further the cause of freedom and godly government. One of the most important actions families can take is to remove their children from the government schools and homeschool them. By now, about 1 million families have made that choice, and their actions have had an accumulative effect on American life that is only now beginning to be felt. While the government asserts implicitly in court decisions here and there that it owns the children, it cannot say so explicitly to the public at large for fear of provoking a violent reaction. And so school districts subtly assert the state ownership principle by requiring parents to request permission to homeschool and requiring homeschool children to be tested. Some school districts require more and some less, depending on the disposition of the superintendent. But in some districts where humanist superintendents refuse to acknowledge parents' rights and impose onerous conditions for homeschooling, parents have had to fight in court to defend their God-given right to educate their children as they see fit. Despite the obstacles involved, the withdrawal of children from the humanist state system is significant because it means that those children will be free from statist humanist indoctrination. It means that that Christian family will be free to raise their children in a godly way, in a way that conforms with the principles and values of the Founding Fathers. These are the children who will mold America's future and restore God's sovereignty over our government. What is also important is what the homeschool movement is doing for the Christian family. Homeschoolers are rediscovering the benefits and joys and blessings of family life. For it is in the family that love for one another and love of God is nurtured. The very act of educating one's children is a godly act called for in Deuteronomy. And therefore it brings the Christian family in obedience to God's law and reestablishes the family as a unit governed under God, equal to the civil government. American civil government was never meant to usurp, replace, or negate family government. The civil government must respect family government, for they both derive their legitimacy from the same divine source. But today's civil government has done all in its power to make the family totally subordinate to the state by taking control of the children through compulsory attendance laws and using state social agencies to undermine the integrity of the family. It is true that dysfunctional families pose a problem for society. But in the past, it was the church or private agencies that dealt with such problems. Today, when the state takes control over a family, it plays the role of God. Social workers place children in foster homes that sometimes turn out to be worse than the homes they were taken from. And of course, drug addiction and unwed teenage motherhood has exacerbated the dysfunctional family problem. Detached from God, these people become the victims of their own innate depravity. But we should not lose our freedoms, and parents should not lose their rights simply because a portion of the population acts so self-destructively. We cannot expect the drug addicts and unwed teenage mothers on welfare to save our country, nor should we let them prevent us from doing what has to be done to restore America as a nation under God. And so the homeschool family is on the front line of this civil war. And we can only win this long, drawn-out war one family at a time. The quiet revolution is taking place right under the very noses of the humanists, and there isn't much they can do about it. Meanwhile, the homeschooling family is creating a revolution in American family life. The Christian family that lives in obedience to God sets a standard of morality that will stay with their children for the rest of their lives. That even some homeschooled children may go astray is inevitable, knowing what we do about human nature. But the vast majority are becoming the kind of citizens we can all be proud of. And so the reconstruction of the American family is one of the great benefits of the homeschool movement. The homeschooling family creates a generation bridge instead of a generation gap. Parents can pass on to their children their spiritual and moral values, thereby creating family continuity unto several generations. Homeschool children learn to respect their parents' intelligence, and the parents who know their children better than any stranger could enjoy teaching their children. I myself have no children, but I've always thought that one of the greatest pleasures of parenthood must be the act of instructing one's own children in all that is good and valuable, showing them what a wonderful world they were born in, what a wonderful God we have that has given us life and inspired our founding fathers to create a country of such great freedom. What a joy it is to introduce children to poetry or great music and art, or the wonders of nature, or to playful puppies and kittens, or to horseback riding, swimming, ice skating, and heaven knows what else. Did you know that homeschoolers learn better than public schoolers? Wherever homeschoolers have taken standardized achievement tests, they've come out ahead of the public schoolers. Why? Because the home is a better place to learn than a school. One-on-one teaching is more effective than the classroom. Also at home, the preschoolers learn from their older siblings. They can't help but learn because they hear it and see it all around them. And did you know that homeschooling parents learn more than their children? Quite an interesting phenomenon. Many parents don't realize that when they begin teaching their children math or grammar or history or a foreign language, they are also learning these subjects. In fact, because homeschoolers generally use phonics to teach their children to read, they improve their own reading skills by learning the phonics they didn't have when they were in school. Most of today's young homeschooling parents were taught to read by the Dick and Jane look-say method and were thus deprived of the kind of intensive phonics necessary to become a good reader. Thus, learning phonics through teaching it to their children has been enormously beneficial. Another important benefit of homeschooling is that the home is a safe haven for the children in a world awash with drugs, sexually transmitted diseases, violence, and moral corruption. Children need all the protection they can get. If you want a child to get involved with drugs, send him or her to a public school, the principal marketplace for drugs in America. That's where peer pressure is used to hook a child. If you want your child to become suicidal, just give him a good dose of death education. If you want your child to become sexually active, just give him or her explicit sex education beginning in kindergarten with instructions on how to use a condom. If you want your child to lose his religious faith, just subject him to endless lessons about evolution, critical thinking, which means criticizing your folks and your religion. If you want your child to start putting rings through his nose and safety pins in his eyebrows or navel, send him to a public school where his peers will persuade him of the beauties of self-mutilation. Homeschooling provides healthful socialization, not the negative kind you get in the public school. In homeschooling, brothers and sisters get to know one another very well, and they become lifelong friends. In the public school, brothers and sisters go their separate ways, bonding with their own clique of friends, engaging in mischievous behavior, drinking, smoking, dating, getting high, listening to acid rock music or heavy metal music, having sex. Homeschooled kids get to know other homeschooled kids. Their Christian code of morals determines their behavior. They believe in courtship, not dating. They are future-oriented, planning to have a long, healthful, productive life. The public school teenager lives for the moment, the thrill, the party. Otherwise, they are bored, hanging out at malls or parking lots, killing time before going home to surly parents who ask, "Where'd you go?" "Nowhere." "What'd you do?" "Nothing." But perhaps the greatest dividend that homeschoolers enjoy is the taking back and mastery of their own time. Time is one of the most precious commodities a family has, and the more time a family can devote to its own improvement and enjoyment, the better it is for all of its members. Public schools squander the best time in a family's life. They rob the family of the time that could be spent together, learning, playing, and creating. The state wants that time in order to do its work of indoctrination. But that time belongs to your family. Another development among homeschoolers is their political awakening. They know that they must get more God-fearing men in the Congress and state legislatures. They made quite a difference in the elections of November 1994. You must become politically active and stay politically active, for the other side would like nothing better than to get politicians in power who will vote to make homeschooling illegal. I think you get the gist of what I am driving at. Homeschoolers are very important to America's future, more important than even they will ever know. They are the revolutionaries doing God's work one family at a time. I like to look at our humanist education system as a big hourglass. Each grain of sand is a child, and every second of that hour, several grains of sand fall through the tiny hole separating the top from the bottom. Eventually, the top will be empty. How long will it take? No one knows. But I look forward to the day when the public schools will be virtually empty, not because we have abolished public education, but because the parents, for the most part, will have abandoned it. Yes, there will be those who will send their children to the public schools out of ignorance or indifference or a misguided loyalty to an institution that no longer works. But the taxpayers may decide that keeping the public schools open for that diminished group is uneconomical, and simply provide the families with tuition to attend private schools. Who knows? We may yet see such a day in the not-too-distant future. That's my remarks, my formal remarks, and now I'll turn to the subject of outcome-based education, which of course is... Outcome-based, that's another reason why you should flee the public schools. You know, as you know, it's called OBE for short. The most radical feature of OBE is that it does away with the traditional requirements for graduation based on the Carnegie units. You know what it was like. Under the Carnegie units, you were required, for example, to take 4 years of English, 2 years of American history, 3 years of math, etc. Each unit was worth a number of credits, and when you obtained the necessary credits, you were eligible for graduation with a diploma attesting to the fact that you had covered all of these subjects successfully. That's the kind of system that I went through. The success of the system was based on the effective teaching of these subjects by competent teachers who knew what they were doing, you see. That's why that system worked in those days. They knew what they were doing. With the students, of course, passing a number of tests to verify that they had learned whatever it was they were supposed to learn. In New York State, for example, we took the Regents tests in order to get our diploma. We had to prove that we had learned something. And of course, in those days, the educators did teach us what they were supposed to teach us. Of course, that was in the 1930s and 40s, quite some time ago. All of us who went through the system remember studying or cramming for the midterms or finals. You hope to get an A or a B plus or a B. Or if you got a C, you passed. If you got a D or an F, you were required to do some sort of makeup or repeat the class. All in all, the system with its compulsory attendance laws requiring children to attend school from the age of 6 to 16 or 18 seemed to work fairly well as long as the schools taught the subjects properly. But when the schools started teaching look-say in reading, and students began having serious reading problems, the system began to break down. It became impossible to expect the ever-increasing number of non-readers to do the kind of reading required to pass the more difficult subjects in the higher grades. The result was social promotion, grade inflation, and a general deterioration of academic standards. And I have done enough research in this area to know that the decline, the disintegration of American education started with the switch in the way they taught reading from the phonetic, alphabetic phonics method, which is the proper way to teach children to read an alphabetic writing system, to the look-say sight method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese. When they put that method in the schools, things began to fall apart. What we have learned from all of this is that the traditional system cannot work if its academic heart has been cut out and replaced by teachers pretending to teach and students pretending to learn. See, that's what they do. It's all a pretense. Because you have children who spend 12 years in school and come out having learned nothing. They can't read, they can't write, they can't add, they can't spell, they can't even speak English very well any longer. So here they spend 12 years in school and have come out with no employable skills. So something didn't take place. Education didn't take place. So what took place in 12 years? Pretense. The teachers pretended that they were teaching, and the kids pretended that they were learning. And that's the result, you see. And that's why there's been such a clamor for back-to-basics reform in the last 30 years. But so far there hasn't been any real improvement in the system, mainly because the educators don't want to get back to basics. See, the kind of education that I was given, which was a perfectly decent one, and many of you people over 60 remember that education. It was a good, very good education. They won't return to it. They refuse to return to it. That's called old-fashioned. It's called all sorts of things. But they refuse to go back to that kind of learning. And I'm not saying that they have to actually go back to it. We can go forward, but we can use what we learned from 3,000 years of educational experience. But they won't. And so the educators have had to come up with a new idea to appease the public. An idea, however, that permits the educators to keep their progressive revolution in education intact while making sweeping changes. The idea is Let's change the system. Let's get rid of the whole traditional system and start afresh. That's what outcome-based education says. Let's scrap the whole system. They talk about restructuring. That's what it's about. Let's get rid of the whole traditional system and start afresh. And what exactly is to replace the old system? Outcome-based education. Now, what is outcome-based education? Well, I found a very good description of it in a project manual that was given to me during a recent visit to North Carolina, where the Gaston County schools were in the process of implementing an OBE program called Odyssey. Oh, they love to put these beautiful names on it. It's Odyssey, you see. That's supposed to make it sound great, futuristic. The program document reads, quote, "The Odyssey project describes a formal system of basic schooling for students ages 3 to 18. Ooh, all of a sudden we're now down to 3-year-olds. With a developmental prenatal to age 3 component. Now we're starting prenatally. We're going to find all the pregnant women and start monitoring their pregnancies, you see. The project will use an outcome-based education model that focuses on the knowledge, skill, and attitudes that students should possess when they graduate from Odyssey Learning Centers. So first we learn that OBE begins with the prenatal child and not only focuses on knowledge and skill, but also on attitudes. You know, when I was going to school, the last thing my teacher was interested in was my attitude, or my feelings, or my beliefs, or my values. She just wanted to teach me basic skills. She didn't want to interfere with what my family had taught me. She didn't want to interfere with my family religion or my family values. She wanted to add to what I brought to school. But here in OBE, they want to take away. They want to remove what you came to school with and replace it with something else. And they call that methodology unfreezing, inserting a new program, and then refreezing. This is what the change agents do. And this has been worked out by the professors in years and years of experimentation. For example, Professor Benjamin Bloom is considered the, you might say, the godfather of OBE. He's the godfather of OBE. And he has worked very hard on this whole business of changing of attitudes, because that's part of the outcome. One of the outcomes is the change of attitudes. They call that orientations, change of attitudes and beliefs. Now, all of these people who have concocted outcome-based education are behavioral psychologists. Behavioral psychologists. OBE was not devised by nice little old ladies who know how to teach children to read. It was devised by the world's leading behavioral psychologists who have been studying the human brain and human behavior for the last 100 years. And Dr. Bloom wrote a book called The Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, in which you have your OBE goals, your outcomes. As a matter of fact, when I was in Kentucky and listening to a presentation by the Kentucky Education Department, they said that they got their 75 outcomes from Bloom's taxonomy. So we know what the source is. And one of the things that the behavioral psychologists are very concerned about, particularly if you want to change a child's orientations and religions and beliefs, is the age factor. They believe that the earlier you get the child, the better job you can do. And that's why they've decided to begin at prenatal. You know, you can't get earlier than that. You know, they're going to start influencing the fetus inside the womb. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they're certainly going to be around when the fetus comes out, and they're going to say, "It's ours, it belongs to us, it doesn't belong to you parents. That new human being belongs to us, we own it, and we're going to shape it. Whether you like it or not." You haven't been told what they're going to do. Your permission or consent was not asked about OBE. It wasn't asked when they put in the whole language, or look say, or Dick and Jane. You weren't consulted. You weren't asked whether you wanted your children to be taught to read phonetically or as if English were Chinese, were you? And you're not going to be asked about what you want your children to believe. And this is what Dr. Bloom wrote back in the 50s when he wrote this book, The Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, which show you they've been working on this. They've been working on this since the 50s. He writes, the evidence points out convincingly to the fact that age is a factor operating against attempts to effect a complete or thoroughgoing reorganization of attitudes and values. He's not just talking about changing a little attitude. He's talking about reorganization, a thoroughgoing reorganization of attitudes and values. The evidence collected thus far, he continues, suggests that a single hour of classroom activity under certain conditions may bring about a major reorganization in cognitive as well as affective behaviors. We are of the opinion that this will prove to be a most fruitful area of research in connection with the affective domain. You see, what the educators did, the psychologists did, was they divided education into two parts, the cognitive domain and the affective domain. Now, when I was going to school, there was only the cognitive domain. There was only academic education. But the behavioral psychologists divided into two parts, the cognitive domain and the affective domain. The cognitive domain is supposed to be related. The affective domain is concerned with feelings, beliefs, values, sexuality, death, all of those wonderful subjects that now dominate today's curriculum, you see. And also these professors found out that you could put a lot of the affective in the cognitive domain. In other words, you can use the cognitive domain to get through a lot of the affective ideas. And I brought with me an example of how that's done. I'll give you an example. Here is a new program for Montana called Systemic Initiative for Montana Mathematics and Science. They're going to teach mathematics and science with this. And do you know what all of this is, what they're going to use to teach that subject? AIDS, the preventable epidemic. So they're going to teach all about AIDS, all about sexual transmission, all the different ways you can get AIDS, which will get in all that sexual stuff they want to get to the kids, with a few algebraic equations. Like how many men who have sex with other men get AIDS? How many of them get it through intravenous injections, all that sort of thing? That's how they've combined the two, the affective and the cognitive. And here it is right in Montana. This is the new big thing that's coming down the pike, and you ought to stop it. You ought to put a stop to this. But it's interesting how he says that a single hour of classroom activity under certain conditions may bring about a major reorganization in cognitive as well as affective behaviors. I'll give you an example of how that actually occurred to a youngster. In a town by the name of Canton, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, they showed a suicide film to the second grade. All the children in the second grade had to watch this film on suicide. Second graders. You know how old second graders are? What are they, 7, 8 years old? The next night, a little boy by the name of Stephen Nalepa went up to his room and decided to imitate what he saw in the film, and he hanged himself. He was not suicidal. He didn't intend to kill himself. He probably was just playing games, decided to experiment. But he killed himself. 1 hour of classroom activity did the job. It really reorganized him for life. He's dead. His parents had no idea that this film was being shown, no requests for approval. Nobody knew that the film was going to be shown. This film was brought from the outside into the class. It was planned. Second graders were shown the film. The film was swiftly removed from the school. They have this system that they do this all over America. They've got these depositories where they keep all of this hot stuff, which then is brought to the school, shown to the kids, and out it goes. And they observe the damage. Now, incidentally, this film was meant to be shown to fourth graders and up. Why was it shown to second graders? Well, the parents sued the school when they found out, that this film had been shown. As a matter of fact, the mother only found out by asking the other kids in the class, "Why do you think Stephen did what he did?" "Oh, well, we saw this film." "What film?" And, of course, they went to court, and the court ruled. And incidentally, during the trial and all of that, do you know what the teachers did? They destroyed their lesson plans. They destroyed the evidence. So they could not determine why the film was shown to second graders. Teachers just destroy. Can you imagine a teacher destroying an entire year's lesson plans at the end of a year and had no intention of ever referring back to what she had learned, what techniques she had used? Destroyed her lesson plans. If that's we always destroy our lesson plans. What did the courts finally rule? Well, that this was a case of educational malpractice and that it could not be litigated because there is so much educational malpractice in the United States that the courts would be inundated with cases. So it was just thrown out. That was it. What does that mean? You put your child in the school at your own risk. The schools will not be held accountable for whatever happens to your child. If your child dies as a result of something they've done in the school, too bad. That's the risk you took, you see. That's the risk you took. And that's the sad story of Stephen Nalepa, a very bright child who would be alive today if he had not seen that film. I call that technique the hit-and-run technique. See, the educators know that parents would object to a lot of the things going on in the schools if the parents knew. So what they do is they do whatever they want to do. The damage is done. You can't undo the damage. And they put up with parental, they know they're going to get some flack. But they figure we can handle that. We always have been able to handle it. And the courts have been very obliging to the educational community. But I asked myself, why did they show this film to second graders? Well, all you have to do is read Bloom. He says that age is a factor operating against attempts to effect a complete or thoroughgoing reorganization of attitudes and values. And so those educators may probably said, gee, why don't we show it to second graders? Yeah, it's a fourth grade film, but let's see what happens. Let's experiment. You see, that's the kind of thing that's going on. In Concord, Massachusetts, where they now have a human sexuality program from K through 12, and I listened to a presentation of the program where the teachers from each grade describe what they do in each grade. In the first grade, they awaken the children's interest in the different sexes by having 2 dolls, which do a striptease. Very titillating. These kids, of course, are too young to even know what the heck is going on. But they're slowly being indoctrinated to understand there is this sex. Well, friends of mine have tried to get somebody to speak about abstinence to the high school there. She's a very devoted, conservative mother. She's taken her kids out of the system. They're now being homeschooled. But she still is concerned about the children who are there. And so she has brought in speakers from other parts of the country. She's had them speak to local groups at a local clubhouse. but she's wanted to get a speaker on abstinence into the high school. Well, it's been a struggle. They say, well, send us a video or show us a book. Tell us about this person. Delay. We have to have a meeting. The committee has to, the committee has to approve, all of that. So they've been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And one day, a girl comes home from school traumatized. She tells her mother, and I believe it was the 8th or 9th grade, she tells her mother, this lesbian spoke to us today in school. We all had to listen to this lesbian speak to us. Another case of hit and run. You see, they didn't tell parents where we have a lesbian scheduled to speak to the 9th grade. Do you want your child to hear this lesbian story? No, they didn't ask the parents that. And from their own protestations that it takes so long to arrange to get a speaker in the school, and it requires such scheduling, obviously they knew that this lesbian was scheduled to speak at a certain time, but kept it secret until this lady could do her work, cause her damage, cause trauma among so many of the young people there, and then leave. That's hit and run. They're doing it all over America because they've discovered that if you inform parents ahead of time, the parents will object. You won't get your work done. And what has been the result? As they always say, you're the only parent who's complained. Haven't you heard that before? You're the only parent who's complained, But that's what goes on. Now, let me get back to that Odyssey project, that wonderful Odyssey project. It says, 5 basic exit outcomes will provide the focus for the instructional program proposed by the project. 1, communicator. 2, collaborator. 3, creative producer. 4, critical thinker. 5, concerned and confident citizen. This is what they want to create. So your child will be a communicator, a collaborator, a creative producer, a critical thinker. Not a logical thinker, but a critical thinker. Odyssey schools will subscribe to the theory of multiple intelligences and will seek to develop each student's unique talents. Performance outcomes set for each level of Odyssey schooling will include substantive assessment of each student's mastery of English, social studies, science, mathematics, objectives, etc. The interesting thing is, when I was in Kentucky, I got hold of the Kentucky curriculum. Now there they have OBE. Kentucky is one state in the Union where the legislature mandated outcome-based education. It has been imposed on the state, and the people there are suffering from it. Now, I got this big book, loose leaf book with all of the pages of the different outcomes for every grade. And you know how they talk about, they describe reading? Constructing meaning. That's their definition of reading. Constructing meaning. Well, that could mean you can teach them hieroglyphics, teach them to read like it's Chinese, but it does not describe the way we teach children to read by an alphabetic, systematic phonics system. In fact, it says in the book, whole language orientation. Whole language orientation. Now, I don't know what you people know about whole language, but there's quite a difference between whole language and intensive systematic phonics. Webster describes reading very simply. He says it's articulating the words on the page in the proper sequence. That's what reading is. It infers reading phonetically. Very simply done. But if you want to know how the whole language people how the whole language people describe or define reading, let me tell you what it is. Let me see where I can. Here's a definition of whole language given by 3 whole language professors in a book entitled Whole Language, What's the Difference? Quote, from a whole language perspective, reading and language use in general is a process of generating hypotheses in a meaning-making transaction in a socio-historical context. I'm sure you all got that. They go on, as a transactional process, reading is not a matter of getting the meaning from the text as if that meaning were in the text waiting to be decoded by the reader. Rather, reading is a matter of readers using the cues print provides and the knowledge they bring with them of language subsystems of the world to construct a unique interpretation. Moreover, that interpretation is situated. Readers' creations, not retrievals of meaning with the text, vary, depending on their purposes for reading and the expectations of others in the reading event. This view of reading implies there is no single correct meaning for a given text, only plausible meanings. This view is in direct contrast to the model of reading underlying most reading instruction and evaluation. You see. Now, when you're a phonetic reader, you become what I call an objective reader. You read what's on the page. You want to find out, what does the author say? And then maybe later on you can worry about what he means, but you first want to know what he says. In whole language, they're saying, forget what the author says. You do the writing. You create the meaning. Now, once you tell children that they can construct a unique interpretation, where are the limitations? There are none. There's no limit to what the kids might do or want to do. And so they believe in, so it's all right if a child leaves out a word that's there, puts in a word that isn't there, skips a word, guesses a word, substitutes a word. Like if the word says horse, they'll say pony or Mustang or mare, and that's perfectly all right because they're seeing something that's trotting along, a 4-legged animal. I mean, this is so ridiculous. This is going to create inaccurate, functional illiterates who can't read. Because first of all, they have not been taught phonics. They are very much opposed to phonics. Why? Because if you can read phonetically, you can stand on your own 2 feet and think for yourselves. You can read anything. You're an independent reader. You're an independent individual, you see. But if you are not taught phonics and are looking at each word as if it were a little picture, as they do in whole language, teaching children to look at English words as if they were Chinese configurations, and telling them to memorize those words or guess what the word says, they call that risk-taking. We are for risk-taking. That means guessing. And word substitutions. Oh, that's great. It shows how creative the children are, you see. That is the official mandated reading program for the entire state of Kentucky in outcome-based education. So what kind of readers, what kind of intelligent people are we going to get out of OBE, you see? And I'm sure that if they put OBE in the schools of Kalispell, you're going to have the very same problem. If you think we have an illiteracy problem now, just wait 10 years. You know how bad the problem is now? 2 years ago, the U.S. Department of Education released the results of its survey on adult literacy in the United States, and they discovered that half the adults in America can barely read. 90 million Americans have been classed as reading deficient, functionally illiterate, half the adult population. And now you have this explosion of attention deficit disorder. You've heard of that? ADD. They're saying that even adults now have ADD. And now you know why. There are 90 million of them walking around who can't read and who are totally frustrated and are moving from job to job because they can't handle these things and are causing tremendous dysfunction within the society, even though we've spent more money on their education than in any previous generation. We're producing more illiterates in America than ever before. And it's not easy producing functional illiterates. You need specially trained teachers. You need special programs, special textbooks. It's not easy keeping someone in school for 10 or 12 years and making sure that he or she doesn't learn to read. What do you do with them for that length of time? Well, as I said, you pretend to teach and you pretend that you're learning. And the American public has been led by the nose to believe that the educators, they're trying so hard, aren't they, to teach these people to read. And there's just something wrong with the kids. They've all got dyslexia. They've all got ADD. There's something terribly wrong with American children. They just can't learn to read. How come they don't have dyslexia and ADD in the Soviet Union? How come it afflicts us only? You know why? Because they used the look-say method. John Dewey brought them the look-say method right after the revolution. And they used the look-say method in the schools of the Soviet Union until 1931, when the Communist Party saw what was happening. They said, hey, we're not going to be able to build the great Soviet socialist empire with a bunch of functional illiterates. So they threw it out and they went back to intensive systematic phonics. And that's why if you go to school in Russia, you learn how to read. There are no dyslexics in the Soviet Union. And we have them in abundance. The interesting thing is that our educators were very disappointed when the Soviets threw out the look-say method. And they knew that it had failed. They knew what it was creating. It was creating illiterates. And they were very disappointed. Now, that was 1931, and the Dick and Jane books and the Macmillan readers, the look-say readers, were put in the schools at that same time in America. So they knew it didn't work. The great experiment in Russia didn't work, but they were now going to inflict that on American children. And of course, by 1955, the problem was so bad that Dr. Rudolph Flesch could write his famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read, in which he explained what the problem was. He said, they're doing it all wrong. They've gotten rid of the phonics method and they're using this stupid look-say method. Well, what has happened since then? Did the educators change anything? No. They retrenched, but they kept on going. To this very day, they refuse to reinstate in the schools intensive systematic phonics. Why? Because it would upset their plans to dumb down the American people so that we can be easily led into the New World Order. So that Americans will give up their freedom, their sovereignty, their children, their families for the New World Order. And you see it all around. You see it coming. You know, the United Nations rights of the child. Have you heard of that? Forget about parents' rights. Children will have every possible right except the right not to go to a public school. Except the right not to be forced by compulsory school attendance to go to school. That's the dead giveaway that this is a totalitarian trap that's being put around us. America is being dumbed down. And we have the proof of it. Even among the very smart in this country, we have the SAT scores. We have the scores of the very top and the scores at the very bottom. In 1970, there was something like 2,700 who scored at the very top. It was, I think it's 750 to 800, which was the top verbal score. Today, that number is half. What's happened to America's brains? What, are they evaporating? Why are they stupider? We're supposed to have this wonderful school system that's doing so many wonderful things. How come we're not producing more smart people? We're getting fewer smart people. But at the bottom, where you have those who get the lowest score, and you can get that score by just signing your name, they say, that number has doubled. So the dumb are getting dumber, and the smart are getting dumber. And that's been going on for years now. And the educators have been able to fool so many people and to force you to pay taxes to pay for this OBE nonsense. Just a little more about this OBE, and then I will open the discussion to you who may have some questions. You know, the OBE project also is involved with changing the school into a social service center. The school is going to be a social service center, and the document states centers will contract with many different agencies to provide health care, social services, wellness, and other essential support programs. Many of the agencies will be housed at the centers. The interagency arrangement will provide holistic support services to learners and their families. Incidentally, the word learner is very important. You see, when I was going to school, we were called students, not learners. Why? Because you were a student from the time you entered school until the time you left school. But you're a learner for life. So that's where they're calling everyone a learner, because they're going to control us from prenatal care right up through the tomb. So that's why now we are all learners. And they use that terminology. And one other thing that's been happening for the last 20 years, as a indication of the kind of control that the system wants to have over every single individual in the United States. For the last 20 years, the National Center for Education Statistics has been working on a computer, a mammoth computer that is going to collect information, data on every single individual in the United States through the use of a Social Security number. And particularly as soon as you're born, you're going to be on the computer, and they will monitor you. They will know virtually everything about you. And all of that will be in a computer. Now, who's going to have access to that information? Who's going to have access to all of that private information about your family, your religion, your political beliefs? And if they don't ask those questions directly, they can get those answers by cross-check. You see, they've got all these different computer files. First, your income tax. They find out, well, who are you donating money to? What kind of phone calls are you making? As you know, every single phone call in this country, long-distance call, there's a record. Every number you call, they know who you call. They know your credit cards. They know what you buy, you see. They even know what movies you rent. Do you know that's all on computer too? You better make sure that you rent only the right movies. That's where we're headed. Well, a totally controlled society, totalitarianism, in a way that has never been fathomed before in history, because they need that control to control us. And the only way that you can escape that now is through homeschooling. That's the best way to get out from under. Now, of course, the state, as I said, will insist that you register and you do all kinds of things. Okay, do that. Just get out of their clutches and teach your children at home and turn them into decent Americans who can read. You see, because they're creating a pyramid type of society through OBE. OBE has 3 certificates, no more diplomas. No more general diplomas, which everybody got. Now it's 3 certificates. There's the certificate for the elite, the academically superior. They're going to be shunted into the big universities, into the major universities. They're going to get the Rhodes scholarships. You've heard of the Rhodes scholarships. Then you have a second tier underneath, a professional certificate for people going into medicine, law, people who want to become anchor persons. They'll get the second tier. Those are the people who are dependent on the elite for their privileges. And then below them will be the Certificate of Initial Mastery. That's the general diploma for all of us peons. And each peon will be shunted off into a specific area of work. They call that the work-study program now, where they're going to be training children to accept certain jobs in certain areas. That's the Soviet system. Incidentally, that's how it's done in the communist countries. It's all being done here. You're getting communism right here in the United States under the very noses of the American people, and they can't recognize it. Why? Because Americans can only recognize communism with a big C. The KGB, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, the Kremlin. That's communism. But communism with a small c, such as cooperative learning, that's small c communism. That's egalitarianism, where every student gets the same grade, gets the average in his group. Small c communism is taking over American education. We're not even aware of it. So that's how far we've come. And the only thing that the only power you really have, I don't think you can reform the public schools. I've talked to conservative school board members who get on, and you know what they go through, the hassles that conservatives go through when they get on a school board. In California, they recalled some conservatives on a school board because these conservatives dared suggest that creationism be taught in conjunction with evolution. And so the other side managed to get these people recalled out. If you want to run for office, run for the state legislature. That's where policies are made. That's where educational policies are made. That's where the NEA and the MEA have their lobby. Right there in Helena. That's where you've got to get your people. You've got to get your people there. And what you can do in the meanwhile, because if you're going to wait for the schools to be reformed for your children to get an education, forget it. Forget it. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. Homeschool, get them out. Put them in private schools, good Christian schools, but get them out. Thank you very much. Yeah, there is such a thing as children who are having problems learning to read. Why are they having problems learning to read? Because they're not being taught in the proper manner. Let me explain to you this way. Children teach themselves to speak their own language all by themselves. Isn't that true? Don't you see it all around you? Little ones, 2 and 3 years old, rattling off, million miles a minute. Now, why do human children have that ability? Because God programmed human beings with the language faculty. He gave Adam the power of speech because he wanted Adam to know him. He wanted Adam to know God, so he gave Adam the power of speech. Along with the power of speech, he gave Adam a grammatical faculty. That is why children learn to speak grammatically correctly very quickly. A child does not say, he is a boy bad. A child says he's a bad boy because they know that the adjective goes before the noun. He didn't go to school to learn that. He learns it because God put software up there. So that's God's software. Logic. All that grammar is logic. It's being able to explain things in a logical manner. So children are born with the language faculty and logic, and they learn like gangbusters. By the time they're 6 years old and ready to enter school, they have developed speaking vocabularies in the thousands of words. So now they enter school, and they're confronted with whole language. And what is whole language? Sheer, unadulterated insanity. That's all it is. It's insanity. It's a form of insanity. Now here's a logical little brain that confronts this insane reading program that makes no sense, is frustrating. The child begins to feel dumb. He says, I'm not dumb, I'm intelligent. But he begins to feel dumb. He knows that something is wrong. Now what do you do when you're in a helpless situation and you know that some sort of harm is being done to you? The first thing you do is you don't pay attention, do you? Well, that's attention deficit disorder. You're not paying attention. Why should you pay attention to something which you feel intuitively is harming you? Another way that you avoid it is to act up. So then you become attention deficit hyperactive, disorder. Because let me ask you this. Supposing you were forced to spend 6 hours in a locked room listening to heavy metal music at a very high decibel. What would you do in that room? Boy, you'd have attention deficit disorder immediately. What would you do? You'd want to smash the speakers if you could, but if you couldn't smash them, what would you? Plug your ears up? Put your mind on something else? Try to distract yourself? Do anything but simply listen to that music. Once you succumb to the music, it would affect your brain. You'd become a vegetable, you see. Which is what's happening to so many young people in America. Well, that's where we get ADD from. That's why we have this epidemic of ADD. Now, how do they treat it? They say, drug the little monsters. Just give them Ritalin, that'll shut them up, that'll keep them quiet, that'll keep them in their seats, and we'll be able to perform our non-surgical prefrontal lobotomy. That's what they're doing to the kids. That's the source of it, because when I was growing up, there was no such thing in the schools. The other nations don't have this affliction that we have, but the people who are working on this, not a single one of them has said, hey, maybe the schools are doing something that's causing this. They're all now saying it's the parents' fault, it's genetics, it's inherited, it's biological. But nobody says, maybe something's being done in the schools that's causing this. I've been saying that for years. See, because we know what the cure is. The cure for dyslexia is intensive systematic phonics. So we know how to cure it, Now, incidentally, the behavioral psychologists have been experimenting on the artificial means of creating behavioral disorganization since the 1920s. They've done their experiments in Russia, and they've done their experiments in this country. As a matter of fact, the social psychologist Kurt Lewin did experiments on what happens to children when they are frustrated. How do children react when they're frustrated? So obviously he had to frustrate the children. And he found out what happens. When children are frustrated, they become violent, they regress. Intellectually, they regress. And they do all kinds of things that are practically the symptoms of ADD. If you read the symptoms of ADD and what happens when children are frustrated, you see there's an equivalent. So the educators know how to cause this. They've been working on these artificial means of producing behavioral disorganization since the 1920s.
So you would also realize at the time that
the problem with that is if you teach a child to read phonetically, they must read from left to right. They must, because the letters are placed in the same sequence in which the sounds are uttered. But if you teach a child to look at each word like a whole picture, you may look at it from right to left, left to right. You look at it from the middle. How do you look at a picture? You look at a picture any way you want. You find a thing in the picture that attracts your attention first. And that's how children try to read when they're using whole language. They try to remember a word by something in it that will remind them of the word. And they don't often come up with the right word, as for example in word substitutions. So a child may see the word horse, but it reminds him of a pony, you see. So he says pony, but that has nothing to do with the phonetic structure of the word, you see. Now, there are some true dyslexics. They are generally seriously impaired children, seriously, what you would call, what do they call that now? Mentally challenged children. You can't say retarded anymore. They're mentally challenged. And I taught one for 10 years, a young man who was seriously impaired. And you know there's something wrong with him. I mean, you know, this is, you can't hide something like that. I mean, he had he couldn't speak. He had a terrible speech problem. He had all sorts of other problems that you could see. So he had a tough time learning to read. I taught him to read phonetically, and yet he would constantly make the same kinds of mistakes that a look-say reader would make. Only when I made him spell the word would the phonics come back, and then he'd read phonetically. But it was his tendency was to look at words as a whole. That was his tendency. But he was seriously retarded. But any normal child, the normal children today who are labeled dyslexic, that's school-induced. There's no reason why a perfectly normal child of normal intelligence, with normal hearing and eyesight, should have any problem learning to read. Maybe they may have, some learn a little earlier, some a little later, some start at 4, some start at 7, but they can all learn, because if they learn to speak, they can learn to read. Yes, ma'am. Well, but the schools are not teaching them phonetically correct. I'll tell you how you can induce the same things that the schools are doing. I found this out quite by inadvertently. I was told that there are children who are entering the first grade already dyslexic. And I said, well, how can that be? They haven't been exposed to any formal teaching. What could possibly cause it? Well, we found the answer. What happens is this. Many preschoolers are given the Dr. Seuss books to read, and they memorize the words as whole configurations, you see. So they become holistic readers on their own. And now it's even easier because the Dr. Seuss books come with an audio tape. So the child looks at the word and hears the word and sees the word as a picture, and so these children develop a holistic reflex. Now, in order to become a good reader, you must develop a phonetic reflex. You must know that the letters stand for sounds, and you must be drilled in the letter sounds so that it becomes automatic, so that when you see the letters, you hear the sounds. And that becomes the phonetic reflex. Once you have a phonetic reflex, you can never become dyslexic. But if you start out with a holistic reflex, you're already starting out with an obstacle, with a blockage to seeing the words phonetically. Because if they have not been taught to read phonetically, their tendency is now to look at all words as whole configurations, you see. So parents should be aware that it's okay to read to these books to their children, but not to have them memorize the words as whole configurations. If they want to avoid that, to start teaching their children the letters and the letter sounds as early as possible so that the child understands that this is a phonetic system, a sound symbol system. Now, the child may be a little young to understand that, but at the same time, try to avoid their learning to read holistically, because then it's going to create problems. Well, you know, the body is a marvelous instrument, and of course it does have problems. There are people who do have strong allergies. There was a case in New England where a young lady who was allergic to shrimp or shellfish asked for a vegetarian egg roll, and by mistake she was given a shrimp egg roll. She ate it and died. So, yes, food can do horrible things to you, but we've known about that, for generations. Why do you think that there are dietary laws in the Bible? The dietary laws were made for our protection. God gave us this wonderful nutritional system. Garbage in, garbage out. Good food in, everything's okay. The point is that we know, and to the extent that we disobey God's law when it comes to food, we, of course, then expose ourselves to all sorts of things. Now, I really don't know to what extent the food that Americans eat is responsible for some of the dysfunctions in our society. I concentrate on an area that I've investigated very thoroughly, and I know what harm the education system is causing, you see. And I'm not really prepared to even talk about the nutritional situation because I really don't know that much about it. And, when you go to health food stores, the people there don't look any healthier than those who are getting their food in the supermarket. So I guess each one of us can take a good deal of abuse when it comes to food. So I really, though, am not an expert on that and can't comment. Yes, yes. Sir. You attribute sanity to these people. You see, you're attributing sanity. Satanic people who are motivated by satanic desires are not sane in what we would call sane. And yet we know they exist in society. We know these satanic forces exist. I mean, take for example communism. People knew that communism would never work before it was even tried. And yet for 75 years the Russian people suffered under communism. Millions of people were killed until just recently when they decided, well, let's get rid of it. It doesn't work. Nazism was also created by a bunch of idiots or very unstable, unhealthy people who led Germany to catastrophe. And so you can fool a lot of people. So we are being led in a direction. We're being led to catastrophe in a way. But Americans, I believe, are being informed enough by now to be able to slow down this locomotive, this train that's going 200 miles an hour toward this New World Order. Now, we're the passengers on that train, and our leaders are up front. And we don't know we know where the train is headed, and we'd like to stop the train. So how do you do it? You know that all of the conductors are on the side of the leaders who are driving. How do you stop this train? You know it's leading you to hell. Well, if there are enough passengers who understand what's going on, they can begin planning on how to slow down and stop this train. Work their way up to the locomotive and get those guys out. Tie them up or whatever. I don't know. I mean, that's just an analogy that I'm making up to give you an idea of what's involved. In other words,